Good evening. I am Dr. Barbara Gannon, Associate Professor of History here at the University of Central Florida. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's installment of the Pauley Speaker Series on Global Affairs. Before I go any further, though, I would like to thank History Department staff who made this possible. Tiffany Ribera, Jessica Oldham, Amira Bacchus, and Sara Embersicia. They make this event happen. This annual lecture is really the highlight of our spring semester. I think I've been here every year I can since I've come 12 years ago, because we receive such refreshing and new perspectives on history. As part of this, though, because it's the highlight of our spring semester, one of the things we like to do is recognize scholarship winners. One is named for Thomas Greenhara, our very distinguished professor of military history, my predecessor. This year's winners were Jeremy Rodriguez and Elizabeth Clements. We also have a scholarship in the memory of Richmond Barge, and this year's winner is Brittany Cook. The Middle Eastern Studies programs offers the Mary Flay McCall Scholarship for Middle Eastern Studies, and this year the winner is Haneen Yamot. Congratulations to all. I'd also like to take time to recognize another absolutely critical element of the Pauley generosity, and that is the funding of travel for our scholars, for international research and professional development. There are no words the extent to which this money is critical to their achieving their goals and their dreams. Dr. Carolyn Chung will receive money for her travel to Barcelona to conduct research on public-private partnerships for urban historic preservation. Dr. Tadashi Ishikawa will go to Tokyo for his project, Travelers, Refugees, and Guest Workers, Gender, Precarious Boundaries, and Japan's Asia in the Cold War. Congratulations to all of the Pauley Travel Award winners. And again, it is an essential amount of money for these people to get their work done. Now on to tonight's event. This is the 15th installment of the Pauley Lecture Series on Global Affairs, and it is made possible by the generosity of Bruce and Mary Ann Pauley. Now, people who are around, I've often been at coffee and people tell me about Dr. Pauley's career here, so I'm familiar, but I'm always surprised by how it's internationally recognized. He taught Austrian history at UCF for 35 years, and his research focused on anti-Semitism and Nazism. He was awarded, and this has got to be unusual, the Austrian Cross of Honor for Letters and Arts. And this year, he received an alumni award from Grinnell College, recognizing him as someone who embodies Grinnell College mission of lifetime learning and service. His generosity and commitment to intellectual pursuits has made tonight's lecture possible, and we thank him. Now, tonight's lecturer is another Grinnell College person. And this is exciting. I was excited about this, and I'm sure a lot of my students are watching at home, because I always talk about Republicans in the before time, as I call it. John Roy Price. He is a retired president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh. During the first Nixon administration, he was special assistant to the President of the United States and executive secretary of the Council of Urban Affairs and the Council for Rural Affairs. He was raised in New York suburb of Manhasset, and he was interested in music. Now, this is where things get interesting and very important for the students listening. He went to Grinnell College in Iowa, studying history. And he earned a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. Now, the whole point of what I'm going to say is history is not the ending, it's the beginning. And all history majors watching near and far should understand that you can do anything with it, as he has shown. He also studied politics and developmental economics. He went to Harvard Law, where he was among the founders of the Ripon Society, a Republican entity modeled on the Bow Group within the British Conservative Party, a bridge for policy between academics and practicing politicians. All right, and now we're going to go on and see what history can do, the kind of adventures you can have. He left New York law practice after a couple of years. He joined a community development entity in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, formed in a bipartisan effort. Bipartisan, that was another before time thing, which you can ask me about, by Republican U.S. Senator Jacob Javits and Democratic U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy. He worked on housing finance, creating a $100 million mortgage pool for home ownership and debt consolidation for residents, overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic. Wow. He left to become the director of delegate intelligence for the 1968 presidential campaign of Nelson A. Rockefeller. Richard Nixon won instead, and the nomination, and he joined the general election campaign. He joined the White House in 1969. He was a special assistant to the president, and he was the executive secretary of the Council for Urban Affairs. He was instrumental in development of President Nixon's social policy. This included guaranteed income for families with children, the Family Assistance Plan, the dramatic extension of the food stamp program and nutrition programs. He also called for a universal health insurance program. And if anyone needs to be revived, we have someone over there who will do it. He didn't very good. He returned to New York. He had a 40-year career in finance, partly with J.P. Morgan Chase. He was a managing director in their investment banking unit. More money. He was a managing director of government relations, both international, federal, and state, in Chase Manhattan prior to its merger with J.P. Morgan. He served for 19 years as director of the Principal Financial Corporation of Des Moines and chaired its audit committee. He was a senior advisor to the Institute of International Finance. He then was recruited to be the CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh, a bank with a balance sheet at the time of $100 billion. One of 12 banks, part of a congressionally chartered liquidity providing system created by Herbert Hoover. There's history all over this, and you can see that history won't stop you. Following his retirement, he became the chairman of the board of MAXEX, or the Mortgage Asset Exchange, an electronic trading platform for purchase and sale of single-family residential mortgages. So, as I said, history is a beginning, not an end. Before he begins his lecture, Dr. Bruce Pauley would like to say a few words.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The trouble with asking a history professor to introduce someone, you're likely to have an introduction that's longer than the lecture itself. So I'm going to try to limit myself. One of my proudest accomplishments was to persuade, I think, in a fairly significant way, Mr. Price to go to Grinnell and be a roommate of mine. I was a freshman at the time and was very enthusiastic about a small liberal arts college, and I think I made some impression on John, who was considering Grinnell but hadn't made any decision. Well, we became fast friends, and this is from the year, it's hard, what year would that have been? 1956. We've been close friends ever since then. Our careers have taken us in very different directions, but we are so similar in many respects. We both love classical music, especially opera. John is an organist, believe it or not, something that I couldn't even play the piano, but he's a musician as well as a music lover. He's traveled all over the world. A few weeks ago when we were chatting on the phone, I said, John, are you a businessman? And he said, well, of course. And I said, but you're always giving a lecture someplace, or you're off in Oxford, or you're in Russia, or someplace in Hong Kong. And he admitted that he wasn't your typical businessman. Unfortunately, my father was a businessman, and he had little choice when he graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1930. There just weren't that many jobs available, so he worked for his father. And I persuaded him to write his memoirs, and the most gripping part of his memoirs was barely surviving the Great Depression, and then volunteering at an age when he didn't need to volunteer or didn't have to worry about being drafted, volunteered to fight for the Navy in World War II, and was wounded on a destroyer escort, which was nearly torpedoed when he was on it. So his most interesting parts of his life were the Depression and the war. And after that, my uncle, who was a partner of his, said that working at the Pauley lumber was 40 years of Dullsville. And if there was ever any question as to whether I wanted to be a businessman or historian, it was easily answered. But John has proved that you can be a businessman and still live a very full and exciting life. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to have him as one of my very closest friends, and I'm very pleased that he could come and speak to you tonight. I think you're going to enjoy his presentation. John.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Dr. Gannon, and thank all of you who have turned out for this evening and who are watching remotely. I'm very appreciative for the chance to do this. I had the pleasure of meeting with some of the faculty members of the department this morning, some of the students from the department this morning, and that was really gratifying. I just said, I'm here, I want to meet and visit with as many as I can. What I would like to do tonight is to show you that, yes, there is a life after being a history major. And Professor Gannon, it is really an honor to be here this evening. Thank you for your introduction, but thank you for the conversation we had and for your really interesting work in military history. And although I studied history as a young man, I'm not a professional historian, as you've heard, and after a brief stint in law practice, I went on to do other things and then came to finance. And in that world, I worked on mortgage finance, trade finance, asset securitization, cash flow waterfalls in subordinate issues of debt instruments, bond underwriting, all things calculated to set your pulses racing with excitement, okay? Anyway, I pivoted after that back to my first passion, which is why I'm here tonight. And this is about history I lived, and I hope I can make it come alive for some of you. The birth of the Republican Party was in 1854, not an historic period through which I lived personally, in a schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. It was the outcome of the collapse of the Whig Party, the dissolution of the Know-Nothings, which were basically an anti-immigration party, the Free Soilers, and then the rise of abolitionists and the urban reformers such as Carl Schurz, and picking up shards of Whig Party policy about national infrastructure, or national improvements, they called it. The Republicans took that idea and ran with it, with things like the Transcontinental Railway, which was started under President Lincoln, and appealing to impoverished urban populations with things like the Homestead Acts. The early GOP, that grand old party, was an energetic exponent of an active national government. That's to say nothing of Lincoln's conduct and characterization of the American Civil War. The Republican Party thereafter in its history has swung back and forth between this assertive action by the central government, the federal government, and shrinking from that with slogans such as "government is the problem," most associated with Ronald Reagan. So there's been a liberal or progressive thread that's run through the Republican Party for most of the 20th century. Started originally with Theodore Roosevelt, and then interestingly, early Herbert Hoover, though he's known for other emphases, and Thomas Dewey of New York, and then Ike. Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, TR, partly because of his own constitution, just how he had taken a hold of himself and had this forward kind of presence, was an early 20th century icon of an activist Republican president. He was sort of the antithesis of the mindset that immediately preceded him. Arthur Larson, who wrote a book called A Republican Looks at His Party, saw 1896 as a high water mark of a constrained view of the role of government. Larson, who was a sort of ideologist for Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, wrote the book in 1956. He opined that the 1896 worldview or ideology, with adherents in both parties, held that business should have completely free rein, that the federal government should confine itself to waging an occasional war, delivering the mails, and enforcing the tariff, and that individual suffering unrelated to military or public service was not a proper concern of the general government. Now, the Karl Rove of his day, Republican Mark Hanna of Ohio, spotted Theodore Roosevelt as a threat to this point of view, as Republicans looked set to nominate TR as McKinley's running mate in 1900. In New York, TR had been very active passing laws against child labor and other unacceptable workplace, health, or safety conditions. Hanna urged Republicans not to choose that cowboy, he called him. They did. TR succeeded William McKinley within months after McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt was a muscular activist president. After World War I, there then followed a period of normalcy, as they called it, in the Roaring '20s, presided over by three Republican presidents, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a paradox. He'd been hugely popular at the end of World War I because he was an engineer, first engineering graduate from Stanford University, met his wife in the same class. They were engineers. But he put together the relief effort following World War I, which fed millions of people in Belgium and Holland and UK and Germany and even Russia during the revolution. So he was seen as a model for young people interested in politics and public life. And that changed. But there were people who were influenced and attracted to him. Among them were Thomas Dewey, later governor of New York, and Herbert Brownell, later Dwight Eisenhower's attorney general. Hoover changed. He became an implacable foe of the New Deal and growth it spawned in the role of the federal government. Therefore, leadership in the activist or progressive republicanism passed into the hands of Thomas E. Dewey, who became governor of New York. Dewey was chosen as the standard bearer of the Republicans twice. He ran against Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, and then in 1948 against Harry Truman, who had succeeded FDR on FDR's death. Dewey was a very progressive leader for his time and was forcefully pro-civil rights, believed in outreach to organized labor, which Hoover certainly did not, and the New Deal was going in that direction. He won re-election twice in the profoundly diverse and complex state of New York. He became the forceful, focused, and highly organized leader of what I like to call the presidential wing of the mid-20th century Republican Party. This cluster of candidates was all of a centrist, activist, or liberal conviction, starting with the governor of Kansas, Alf Landon, who was selected to run the time after Hoover had been beaten in 1936. Then Wendell Willkie in 1940, Tom Dewey twice, Eisenhower twice, and Nixon twice. So from 1936 through 1972, the GOP presidential candidates or victors were moderates or progressives, with only the aberration of the Barry Goldwater nomination in 1964. The congressional Republicans were much more conservative. The paragon of the mid-century Republican conservatives was Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, known as Mr. Conservative. Taft was the main internal opponent to Dewey, and then in 1952 to the nomination of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. General Eisenhower narrowly defeated Taft for the nomination in '52 and then beat Adlai Stevenson in the general election. Ike had a sunny disposition, Midwesterner, Kansas and Texas. There was general prosperity during his presidency. Its years were in many respects the high water mark of the American middle class. A generation had just returned from winning World War II and did not wish to go to war against the New Deal. I think that defines a lot of those people coming into Congress in 1946 and 48. Policy in Eisenhower's terms reflected that. He greatly expanded Social Security. He also dramatically changed the landscape of health insurance. During the Eisenhower years, the conservative wing of the GOP felt defensive, even suppressed, with Ike's policies being very popular. But as his second term grew to a close, the anti-government wing of the Republicans began to find their voice again. The conservative movement, in quotes, as it was called, grew powerful. As Patrick Buchanan has expressed it to me, their reaction to the moderation of Eisenhower modern republicanism was the Counter-Reformation. Literally, that's what Pat calls it, the Counter-Reformation. So conservatives worked at local and state levels to capture the party machinery. The movement managed to nominate Barry Goldwater in 1964, despite the fact that a majority of Republicans didn't want him as their nominee. In 1964, the GOP was still largely a northern party, Northeast, Midwest, West. The election proved calamitous for Republicans. While peeling away Southern conservatives from their long allegiance to the Democratic Party began that year, the carnage in the North was immense. Leading up to that 1964 debacle, and regrouping and continuing after it, was the growth of the conservative infrastructure. This infrastructure included publications like the National Review and Human Events, mass membership organizations like Young Americans for Freedom, and advocacy groups like the American Conservative Union. There was a moderate Republican counterthrust to this conservative swell. In 1962, the Ripon Society was formed. Ripon was a group of young graduate students and professionals in the Boston area, and I was among its founders. It was not a mass membership entity. It was modeled on a British group, as our introducer, Dr. Gannon, said, called the Bow Group. And like them, we sought to be a bridge between academia and Republican office holders or office seekers. I was the first employee of Ripon as its research director while attending law school full-time, 20 hours a week for Ripon and managing to get a law degree. C+, but I got it. Anyway, several ideas that percolated up through Ripon became policy that Nixon was to embrace on entering the White House in 1969. Chief among them was a form of universal basic income, UBI we call it today. More on that soon. Besides electing several liberal Republican senators and governors, 1966 saw the election of Ronald Reagan as governor of California. Reagan's victory portended the ultimate, utter transformation of the GOP from a Dewey, Eisenhower, Nixon activism. But first, there was 1968. To claim his nomination, Nixon had to fend off efforts by Governor Nelson Rockefeller and the new governor of California. They relied on an unsuccessful pincer movement by the two coastal governors, one the New York liberal and the other a conservative Californian, to halt Nixon's drive to the nomination on the first ballot. 1968 was a year where Republicans were as torn apart as today. Vietnam was dividing the country and sapping its energies. Dramatic shifts in sexual and social behavior were frightening or appalling many. Civil rights had come into clear focus, and the violent rearguard action of segregationists shocked most Americans. Assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy cast a pall over politics as they demonstrated the ugliest reaches of hatred. Over 100 cities in America burned with outbreaks of that violence, often racially charged, just in the year before the '68 election. Reflecting the country's mood, Nixon campaigned on law and order. But he constantly also struck a more hopeful tone. From his acceptance speech in Miami to his victory remarks on election night, and then his inaugural address, Nixon sounded emollient, hopeful notes. He spoke of healing the country. He spoke of addressing racial grievances and meeting needs of the poor and disfranchised. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address 8 years earlier had not even mentioned domestic affairs, stressing only we will bear any burden in our international life. Nixon, with his Quaker roots, did propose outreach in peace to foreign adversaries, and we saw this with the Soviet Union in the SALT agreements, strategic arms limitation talks. At the same time, those same subterranean Quaker streams flowed in his new administration into a strategic and cohesive array of social policy initiatives. Nixon was later to lament that he would be remembered only for Watergate and for his dramatic opening to China. Nixon's environmentalism, creation of the EPA, is possibly the main initiative of his that still rings a bell in the memory of his time other than Watergate and China. But the 37th president should be remembered for something else, his social policy, focused on those at the edges of American society, in need and without support from the safety net begun to be put in place during the harshest moments of the Great Depression. In some of these, Nixon succeeded, in others only partially, in still others he failed, but he put down markers for future leaders. But the Republican Party was going a very different way. Nixon built on and expanded Dewey's and Eisenhower's efforts in social policy. My work as his special assistant focused on his welfare, hunger, and health initiatives. These are among his most important. There was disinterest, even outright opposition by many Republicans to his proposals, especially his family assistance plan, which was a kissing cousin to a universal basic income. And enter at this point a fascinating man who was my boss and whom I succeeded, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was brought in because welfare was an issue in 1968 that created battle lines almost as immigration does today. It was that divisive an issue. The explosion in caseload in northern cities demanded a policy response. And as his assistant to the president for urban affairs, he brought in Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Pat was an active Democrat who I supported Nelson Rockefeller against Nixon. Pat Moynihan worked for Bobby Kennedy and then Hubert Humphrey against Richard Nixon, and Nixon still reached out and asked him to become one of his top 2 assistants in the White House, along with Henry Kissinger. Anyway, in Moynihan, the new president found an aide passionately engaged in the issue of poverty and family cohesion. But there was something else which attracted Nixon to Moynihan, again, something which has some reverberations today. Something that Moynihan had sounded an alarm in 1967 in an article and in a speech to the Americans for Democratic Action, both titled The Politics of Stability. He wrote, and this is a quote, "Liberals must see their essential interest is in the stability of the social order. And given the present threats to that stability, they must seek out and make much more effective alliances with political conservatives who share their interest and recognize that unyielding rigidity is just as great a threat to continuity of the social order as an anarchic desire for change." So Nixon and Moynihan were to draw close, not only on the welfare reform, but this larger goal of restoration of confidence in government's power to act successfully and to meet public needs was shared. Now, Nixon, as I mentioned, was attracted to Henry Kissinger. Nixon always loved foreign policy. Every president does. Even Thomas Jefferson, I was saying to some of your colleagues this morning, that was his interest. Anyway, he went to Henry Kissinger as a fellow strategic thinker in foreign affairs. But in like fashion, Nixon came to engage with Moynihan on domestic strategic thinking, a strategy of jobs and income. This was to address the problems of poverty, rural and urban, and the kinds of hopelessness and frustration that had led to unrest in American cities, large and small, and despair in rural America as jobs and people left, much like what we look at today. Nixon appreciated the intellectual engagement that Moynihan stirred up around these issues. They were serious thinkers, both of them. Nixon was process-oriented also. To shape domestic policy in a more structured fashion, he created the Council for Urban Affairs and named Moynihan its executive secretary. This was the very first executive order that he signed 2 days after he was inaugurated. The folks standing behind President Nixon are all members of the cabinet, except for State and Defense. They were all domestic cabinet members. And the tall guy at the back right is Pat Moynihan. And over there at the door to the Oval Office, that is I guess correctly I say, in the dark suit, standing with my back to the Oval Office. And it's, and there was more of it. Anyway, but in only 11 months, I was to succeed Pat Moynihan as executive secretary. And that is myself with my back to the camera. And now in 11 months, I moved from the doorway to the table. And so Pat Moynihan's to my left, John Ehrlichman over to my right, and the president, middle of the table on the right. John, I have to interrupt and add here. Look at that picture. John was barely 30 years old at that time. It's all history major. History major. Double that age. Would you feel just a bit intimidated? Although I think he admitted that he wasn't intimidated, but he got through it. Anyway. That is a remarkable picture. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Well, Nixon and Moynihan talked often of Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli was a Tory or conservative British prime minister who turned the Tory party to liberal measures to address the social injustices in Victorian Britain. As Nixon would see it, Tory men with liberal principles are the ones who have changed history. And to do this, Nixon, Moynihan, and others worked toward 3 dramatic goals in the very first months, all related to his strategy of income, cash, or purchasing power in the hands of the poor, and all leading up to the Family Assistance Plan. First, in April '69, upon learning that those Americans who were earning below the formally defined federal definition of poverty were required to pay income tax, he removed them from the rolls. He said, what's the logic of that? This was the first signal that Nixon would attach great importance to helping the plight of the working poor, those wage earners who often were working full-time but unable to make enough to support themselves or their families. The second dramatic goal was stated in Nixon's message on hunger in May of 1969. Here he laid out a vast revamp of the programs of food and nutrition assistance. He rationalized the food stamp program. Food stamps were non-existent in many, if not half, counties of the United States when he took office. And standards of eligibility were not in place, nor benefits. They were different from place to place. So Nixon's proposals were enacted into law with bipartisan support, providing the nation's first guaranteed income for the poor and near poor. It's been a crucial part of the safety net, providing food purchasing power to millions of American families. The jewel in the crown of Nixon's income strategy was his Family Assistance Plan. When talking with Moynihan then and later, Nixon would speak of it as, quote, our monument, close quote. The full edifice never got built. The central idea of a tapering off or income-tested cash payment to low-income families, both working independent, was the core. While it failed to pass, due to both liberal and conservative opposition, it evolved into both the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit of today's debates. FAP would have placed a national floor under the income of families with children. Like food stamps at the time, existing welfare programs varied wildly from place to place, even county to county. In many states, mostly the old Confederacy, the benefits did not even approach those states' own definitions of subsistence living. They were below their own, Mississippi's own definition of what you can survive on, subsist on. FAP would set national standards of eligibility. And as a negative income tax, those with no income would get a monthly payment to bring them to the floor. For those working, it would supplement incomes with a credit or payment, the working poor. As to those with jobs, this is exactly what the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, now does. But Nixon's plan also embodied a child tax credit type strategy. It provided a floor for incomes of families with children whose parents were not able to work or to find work, the dependent poor. FAP was to attack and alleviate poverty. It was a conscious and coherent contrast to the poverty program in President Johnson's War on Poverty, which was centered on services, not cash payments to the poor. Moynihan and Nixon said, what is being poor? It's not having enough money. That was the core underlying sense of it. As we saw with the expanded child tax credit during last year, 21, the lifting of children out of poverty was extraordinary. Nixon's family assistance plan at the time of his announcing it would have done the same, almost eliminate poverty. Nixon imagined wrongly that Democrats would join his effort. And it was actually the right or the conservatives who sounded the death knell of his proposal for a UBI. This is President Nixon with Governor Reagan at San Clemente in mid-August of 1969. When Nixon decided to try to coax then Governor Ronald Reagan into support of FAP, the Family Assistance Plan, Nixon had me write the briefing paper preparing him and asked that I be with him for the meeting with Reagan at San Clemente, the California White House. We were sitting there at sea level, and I could look out and I could see surfers on that superb stretch of Pacific coastline surfing. We were at sea level. But I felt with these two guys as though I were atop a continental divide. On the one hand, Nixon's view of the requirement for and efficacy of federal action on matters of poverty and need, and on the other, Ronald Reagan with his mantra of government is the problem. Reagan rallied the right against FAP. Decades later, with the 96 and 97 welfare law changes, Reagan's view had become dominant. Reagan's and ongoing GOP opposition to what he called redistributionist ideas and emphasis on reducing assistance roles through harsh work requirements and cutoffs of help, these were the drivers of the mid-1990s legislation. Republicans in control of Congress sent the bills to President Clinton, thinking he wouldn't sign them. He did. Most of the issues that boiled up into that legislation had been debated by us with Nixon almost 30 years earlier. What kind of work requirements for those who should be eligible, how draconian, and on. How to mesh together various assistance programs so they would not simply pile up on top of one another, giving the people eligible for them a more secure position in the economy than many who were working full-time, and prompting resentment through that. Also and always cost. Part of Nixon's FAP did make it into law as the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. This put a floor under the income of the aged, of the partially and totally disabled, and of the blind. They were combined into something. And Governor Dewey died just about the time that happened, before passage of SSI. He had urged this same proposal of income security for those categories 30 years earlier, in 1938. So Dewey would have gratefully acknowledged Nixon's successful push for what the progressive governor had put forward. He would have grieved it had taken 3 decades since he called for it. But the core of FAP, the guaranteed income, failed. It passed the House of Representatives twice. We pulled a cork the first time, and it went through the translucent panes in the ceiling of Moynihan's office, and the cork smudge stayed there for the remaining 1.5 years of his time in the White House. But it died in the Senate Finance Committee. Liberals like Senator Eugene McCarthy voted against it. Conservatives like Senator John Williams voted against it. Nixon tried to revive it again in the winter of 1973. It was even more expansive. The right wing called it Big FAP. The right wing, Pat Buchanan again, said to me, John, he said it was like Moby Dick to us. We had to slay it. It was hounded and slain. Nixon wrote Moynihan, this is a direct quote from their correspondence. He wrote, Pat, it is a national tragedy that an unholy alliance of the far right and left killed FAP. Food stamps were a singular victory of the Nixon administration and survive as SNAP, FAP, SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. And tens of millions have been helped by that. Health insurance, this is my last topic. President Nixon's attempts at health insurance, in my view, give the deepest insight into his attitudes toward the role and responsibility of the federal government of any of his social policy attempts or successes. Within his first year as president, Nixon introduced his welfare reform, FAP, and this became his early domestic priority. Nixon was a relative latecomer to issues of public welfare. Not so with health policy. In this, he had a much longer and deeper understanding. He had empathy for those overwhelmed by serious health problems. 2 of his own brothers had died of tuberculosis. They had no health insurance. His mother had to go to Arizona separately for a year or more for each one of them, working with other patients to help pay for her own son's care. They both died. And so this was powerful with him emotionally. And it was also informed by his involvement in the changes that had occurred under Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower oversaw the creation of the most expansive healthcare and private insurance coverage of the latter 20th century, called ESI, Employer-Sponsored Insurance. And when the war had ended, a major boom ensued, and employment grew dramatically. But the medium for the massive expansion of health insurance was the Internal Revenue Code. And in the 1954 revisions to the code, which I used to practice as a tax lawyer until I ran screaming into the night, it was part of a wholesale overhaul of the code. It clarified and expanded the availability of tax deductions for employers and freedom from taxability of employees who were the beneficiaries of an employer-sponsored program. Anyway, Nixon first stepped into the healthcare debates even earlier. In 1949, Harry Truman, after his unexpected election over Tom Dewey, tried to promote what we would today call a single-payer health care proposal. And Congressman Richard Nixon, in only his second term, joined the most liberal member of his party in the House, New York's Jacob K. Javits, and 2 liberal, my mentor, and who had me go to Bed-Stuy to work there, and 2 liberal Republican senators to introduce a private insurance system which would cover all without regard to whether they could afford the premiums. Nixon did not align himself with the crusty conservative lion, Robert Taft, in Taft's tepid and constrained response to a Democratic move toward fully federally funded and overseen medical care. Taft's route was to defer to the states to point the way at their own pace and with their own often meager percentage of participants in health insurance programs. Nixon was a marquee name on activist legislation with Republican liberals. And doing so, once again, this is myself on the left, and with the sideburns appropriate in 1969, 71. Then Nixon, you can tell, of course, he's sitting talking next to him to Congressman Burns of Wisconsin, who was the ranking Republican on Ways and Means, which had jurisdiction over health. And then there's Gerald Ford next to Nixon, and then this is Secretary Elliot Richardson. And we were discussing healthcare. So more than 20 years after his efforts in counterpoint to Truman's single-payer idea, Nixon returned to healthcare and health insurance. He was now the president. His approach again centered on addressing the totality, using the private sector with extensive federal government direction, oversight, inducement, and subsidies where required, so everybody could afford the premiums. He started by recognizing the enormous impact on coverage that Eisenhower's employee-sponsored insurance had. And in a briefing, he said to us, Some 65, this is a quote, some 65% of employers have insurance now. Employers have it now for their employees, which is up to the minimum standard. We'll expand to the balance. Expand to the balance. That's exactly what the 1971 proposal did. The core parts of the plan included a National Health Insurance Standards Act, a family health insurance plan, and health maintenance organizations. His plan would extend private insurance coverage to the balance by having all employers of one or more employees provide a minimum stated standard coverage for employees and their dependents, including pediatric care, vision, dental, inpatient hospital care, extended care facilities, home health services, outpatient care, catastrophic cost protections. And private insurance pools were to be established for risk sharing among small employers, the self-employed, and those outside the labor force. Then the family health insurance plan would provide insurance to all low-income families with children not covered by employer plans, and on it went. But neither it nor any part of the 1971 plan on which I'd worked achieved passage that year, and I went home. Went back to New York in December of 1971. Besides medical association opposition, the Democrats, as they had with Nixon's welfare proposal, could not bring themselves to support his ideas given their patrimony, given who they had come from. Caspar Weinberger succeeded Elliot Richardson as Secretary of HEW, and he came at a good time because Watergate was beginning to play out, the drama of Watergate. And it gave Secretary Weinberger more sway over policy than Elliot Richardson had, meaning the White House got less involved. They were too busy on fighting fires. And Weinberger offered the president options at the end of 1973, which he did embrace, and Nixon announced his plan in the State of the Union only weeks later. There was the comprehensive health insurance plan, and moved on again in terms of expanding coverage and reducing co-pays and deductibles and that sort of thing. And the eligibility benefit standards would be set by the feds and apply uniformly. And this is, to me, one of the most profoundly persuasive points I think I can make. A benefit which Nixon proposed that has particular resonance today is that no individual could be denied insurance because of pre-existing conditions. That was 40 years before the Affordable Care Act, before Obamacare. Nixon proposed that. And premium levels and copays would be related to income and so on. Then what happened, there was serious discussion of the possibility of the individual mandate, which Obama faced and went one way, Nixon had gone another way. But all the way back to the 40s, Nixon had been in favor of full, universal coverage using the private sector. And then, believe it or not, the liberal lion in the Senate, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, in the spring of the Watergate conclusion, in the spring of '74, Nixon and he talked, and they set to work their top people. Ted Kennedy picked Stan Jones, who was his top legislative person, and Nixon, through his Secretary of HEW, picked a friend of mine, another Ripon Society guy, Deputy Assistant Secretary. And those people met in the basement of an Episcopal church, an Anglican church, on Washington's Capitol Hill for 4 or 5 weeks, working and negotiating away and trying to hammer out an agreement. And it came preciously close. Kennedy capitulated to Nixon on a few things, like deductibles and coinsurance. The position of labor was you can't impose any costs at all on people. And Nixon said, no, you've got to have some, but we'll cover it through subsidies if we have to. And they couldn't make it stick. Kennedy got pushed back by labor, and Caspar Weinberger told my friend, he said, the right wing is killing us. The conservatives are killing us. So it collapsed just literally 6 weeks or so before Nixon's resignation, maybe 8 weeks. And Kennedy is said to have said to the end of his life, the greatest mistake of his entire career was not cutting the deal with Richard Nixon and having national health insurance. And I thought that might just be an urban legend, But I had lunch with Senator Christopher Dodd, former Democratic senator from New Jersey, in 2016 in April. And we were talking about my book, which was still in gestation. And I said, Senator, I've heard that Kennedy really said that. And Dodd said, John, he said, he didn't say it to me once. He said it to me at least half a dozen times, that it was the greatest mistake of his career. So Nixon was a transition figure. He was the last gasp of Eisenhower moderate republicanism, even more liberal than Eisenhower. And so in his expansive, energetic employment of the national government to set standards for and try to deliver help to the most needy, he really does represent the end of the line, the last Republican president to believe in an aggressive stewardship, caring for need and want. Richard Nixon can be remembered for something other than China and Watergate, and should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that was fascinating. And I was actually a teenager that remembered Nixon. Whoa, what a version Okay, first, I think what is time is for some Q&A.
Great.
I have a million. Okay, so I'm going to pass this out to people. Testing? Yes. If you have a question, please call, get to me, and I will go back. Questions, please?
They're waiting for yours. Oh, here's one. Okay.
Mine is very quick.
Yes.
I was wondering if you can say some words about his liberal or his standing in international politics. Did it reflect in his standing in dealing with the international issues?
Yes, I had a sort of humorous moment when he was, as I put it, on Elba in exile, and I accidentally was out there seeing a friend who was working for him, and he said, "Come in and see the boss." And I went to talk with him, and we talked about many things, from faith and reason and their conflicts to you name it. But I said to him, sort of chidingly, I said, "Now, Mr. President," I said, "you've always been more interested in foreign policy than domestic." He said, no, John, I really, trying to make me feel better. But the fact is, yes, of course, he loved it and was good at it. I think about his post-presidency in exactly these terms, in terms of his international. This man had been traveling and talking at very top levels since 1953. He was Eisenhower's vice president. He'd met, he met and knew Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, all those 20 or 50 Italian prime ministers who came and went through the time, And he had this relationship with leaders all over the world. And so he reverted to that after Watergate, and he was a broken person in spirit when I saw him. It was the only time I think that I'd ever been around him when I felt he was needy, really needy. But he bounced back from that through sheer grit, and he found his niche again, or métier, in his international affairs. One thing I'm most fascinated with, given the current Russia-Ukraine thing, is that at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, when Yeltsin finally came in, Herbert Walker Bush 41, was still president, and Nixon was pleading with Bush to mount a Marshall Plan for Russia. I mean, a massive economic development plan. And he wrote Bush, I can't remember the exact language, but he said something like, "When again, if ever, will we have as a counterparty in Russia a non-expansionist leader who is interested in a transition to an economy which is basically on capitalism, and which in turn hopefully will lead to more liberal ideals." So he pleaded, and Bush just didn't go the whole way on it. But so I remember from one of his many foreign trips, I was at the University Club in New York, and he came in and he spoke to there were maybe 250 of us sitting in the second floor dining room. And he held forth on his recent trip to Russia. And it was absolutely absorbing. He talked of his time with Gorbachev, whom he said was going to be a hinge figure of the 20th century because he had allowed German reunification peacefully. And he then met with Yeltsin, who said Yeltsin, much more than Gorbachev, is a visceral politician. He's got a gut feel for the voters and people. And he also met with Gennady Zyuganov, who was head of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and talked about how charmed he was and how a good conversation they'd had. I later saw Zyuganov at a luncheon in New York, and I went up to him and I said, Richard Nixon said this about you. He just lit up like a Christmas tree, you know, the head of the Communist Party of Russia. But he glowed in that element, and the built up contacts and the wisdom and the experience meant that he was formidable in that world. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, thank you.
This is my daughter-in-law, Firla, this is her first business trip since her maternity leave. And my granddaughter is home with my son.
Thank you.
Firla.
It sounds like if Nixon had followed a different political strategy and built different alliances, he might have gotten the family assistance program passed. Do you think that's true? And what do you think he should have done?
He fought hard. The reality is, as the conservatives tell me, because they were fighting back the whole time, he fought hard he made the assumption that the liberals would be with him because it was basically a liberal proposal. It was out of the box for a Republican, just outside of any thinking, though it wasn't, because Milton Friedman had been Barry Goldwater's economics advisor in the 1964 campaign, and in 1962 had written a book called Capitalism and Freedom, in which he advocated a negative income tax. And of course, the Ripon Society had advocated it, and a lot of economists from Johnson and Kennedy's administrations too. And the first time I really ever sat down with Nixon was 3 days before he announced for his run in the 68 presidential campaign. I was at a dinner for about 8 or 9 of us. And I said, you know, you might want to consider this fascinating convergence of opinion from conservatives and liberals on this negative income tax. And he said, I know welfare is an issue in the campaign. I am not ready yet to talk about specifics. But then what happened was he presumed the liberals would be with him. And I may have told some of you this already, but on Christmas Eve of '69, I was sitting in front of his desk, and with me was a guy named Jean Mayer, who'd run the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. And Mayer had brought this fat report of the White House Conference. I think it ran to 2,300 pages, and gave it to Nixon. Nixon then pushes it over the table and gives it to me to implement. And then Nixon starts talking about his family assistance plan. And again, showing how he presumed liberal support. He said, John, you know, we've got to get it, and we will. You know, the Democrats will certainly have to be for it. He said, of course, what they will do every year is the Democrats will vote to raise the floor under the income of families. And he said, every year our Republicans will vote against that. He said, every year they'll lose and the floor will get raised. He said, but John, it doesn't matter, because the important thing is we will have established the principle. Okay. And so he presumed the support of the liberals, but they couldn't, it was a bone in their throat. It was Richard Nixon. You know, there's been this history of just dyspepsia or worse. And then the conservatives, as I say, in that meeting with Ronald Reagan, I sensed that we were going to have huge trouble. And that's where it really built up on us. His political antennae were better about the conservatives than about the Republicans, which is why he'd pulled Reagan in and tried to romance him to get him to buy into it. But Reagan saw an opportunity to redirect the party away from Eisenhower and Nixon, which is exactly why Nixon was the transition and final figure of that long arc.
Someone else? Another question?
This isn't so much a question as it is a reminder of what you told me about the last time you saw Nixon, and he was in a very wistful mood. and he said, "I'm afraid the only thing I'm going to be remembered for is Watergate and the opening of China."
Yes, yes.
And I think your book has done a great service to opening people's minds about there's another Nixon that tried to do a lot and succeeded
In many,
way
many
more
ways.
than that we can remember.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the great contribution.
And there's also,
of your book.
also an important other footnote from that meeting, and it was that there had been some experiments conducted by the poverty program, the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, on income maintenance, things like the Family Assistance Plan. They'd been done in Trenton, in Seattle, and in Denver, Colorado. And at first, the results appeared to be very supportive of what Nixon was proposing. And John Ehrlichman was sort of showing the results and helping to sell Nixon on the embracing of the principle. But then what happened, going on a few years, was that the data coming back were not so positive. And they were indicating that it hadn't cured the issue of family breakup, which was one of the problems that welfare reform was meant to address. The disincentive to stay together, the man in the house stories. And so, but that was what I was carrying around in my head because I'd been doing, trade finance and cash flow waterfalls in subordinate structures and so on, not paying much attention. But the University of Wisconsin Center on Poverty had done some subsequent work, which tended to swing the pendulum back toward rather some support of the idea of the negative income tax. But I was unaware of that. And I went to see Nixon suitably enough at the Jacob K. Javits, federal office building in Lower Manhattan, where Nixon then had an office, because they were so close, and Javits was my mentor. And he asked me, he said, "John, would family assistance have worked?" And I paused and I said, "Mr. President," I said, the results of the later part of the income maintenance experiments cast that into uncertainty. I said, "I'm just not sure." At which point he turned aside and just looked off into the distance for some moments. Oh.
So I know a big problem with Watergate was some sort of accusation of a bugging device or some recording device in the room, which again, to his point, he had a better legacy than the scandal. For my generation, do you think if you wanted to run, you could run on a platform of trying to...
Right near my left elbow, the upper left-hand door.
Oh, okay, cool.
I've got a great recording of my kibitzing with him about my congressional campaign, which was wholly abortive, unsuccessful. Anyway, I interrupted you.
My question was going to be, there's a lot of requirements. One, I haven't held previous office. I'm not 35, so neither of those are met. I was going to ask, do you think you could run a campaign upon trying to educate the populace on cybersecurity rights? Because a lot of things like Facebook, when you register your account, people don't realize that your metadata for that is very valuable to advertisers. And you're typically somewhere in the account registration, you're saying we give Facebook permission to use that data to, I think OCEAN's the acronym, to advertisers. Shouldn't there be a cut of that goes to the person's account?
I'm sorry, just put the main point of the question to me, forgive me.
I think he wants to know, could you run on that, correct?
Yeah, could you possibly run on a platform of trying to educate voters about
Could you run on a
digital
platform of
cybersecurity?
educating voters on cybersecurity because of all the privacy?
Oh, I think that's a very important issue today. I don't know how Nixon would respond to it, but yeah, privacy is a horrendously big issue. So, but I can't see how you translate it into a political campaign solely. There's so many issues out there right now, like preserving NATO and how do we deal with China and the fact that we've dropped the child tax credit enhancement and on it goes. So that would be an issue, but one among many.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the talk and getting your eyewitness perspectives on events in the White House. I learned a lot. I was wondering if you could also just share some of your thoughts on the savings and loan crisis and the 2008 crash, because it sounds like you had kind of a front row seat to both those events in terms of what you see as maybe the lead factors, sort of who are the heroes, and your own just views on it.
Thank you. The S&L crisis, which was basically 89, 90, 91, led to a couple of statutes which, well, first of all, led to the creation of the Resolution Trust Corporation, which basically went in and dissolved a lot of thrifts which had gone way out on limbs in lending against commercial property largely, but also home properties. The 2008 crisis was much more turning around home mortgage finance. And here I was in the thick of it. We were, as the home loan bank system, part of 12 nationwide, whose balance sheet ultimately became $1.5 trillion. We were trying to provide liquidity to the banks and the insurance companies and the thrifts, remaining thrifts in the country. And we were doing that according to the plan that Herbert Hoover had created in 1930, December of 1930. And it was working. We were making collateralized loans against eligible collateral of all these banks. And they were, securities like treasuries or, solid mortgage-backed securities. But it was very interesting because it happened like that. I mean, I stopped us lending to Lehman Brothers. They were one of our clients, and I just said, no more of that. And we got out before they collapsed. And though we had some counterparty arrangements with them, which we managed to liquidate. But interestingly, the crash really caused the Fed to slowly wake from its sloth. And the home loan banks, as I was fond of saying at the time, the home loan banks were out lending into the problem to the institutions which were facing losses before the Fed had gotten up and in its pajamas and had its first cup of coffee. We were accustomed to being collateralized lenders. And so there it was very much the residential market as opposed to the S&Ls, which, yes, derivatively were secondarily were the residential market, but it was more institutional collapse. And in this case, it was the whole market was going under. And what happened was there was just enough greed to go all the way around. And for everything starting from the originators to the brokers, the property brokers, to the appraisers, to the banks which bought the mortgages which were originated, to the consolidators of the mortgage. And then you had many of those same banks and others were the securitizers of securities based upon those mortgages as their underlying collateral or assets. And it was all over the place. And so it was tragic. And I think more than the savings and loan, I think the 2008 crisis was one of the ingredients in the growth of the real ugly and angry side of the country that we've seen, because very few people who deserved to went to jail. People lost their homes and they lost assets that they had invested in. So I think that was a very important turning point in American politics, not just in the capital markets or in the mortgage finance markets. Is that any kind of answer? Kind of?
Okay. Oh, I have one question here.
Yes, ma'am.
You worked with Nixon.
Yes.
I thought he was a very rational kind of guy. I liked his foreign policy, even when I didn't like him many other things. Where did Watergate come from? That was like nuts.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was blessed by not being asked to do any political stuff. Don't forget, I'd been a Rockefeller guy, so I don't think I was totally trusted on the politics. And, but if I could, I'm going to try and quote to you something which explains a lot about Nixon and the fact that he does have that side, did have that dark side. And it is a quote from his law partner, Leonard Garment, who was my boss in the general election campaign in the fall of '68, and was very close to Nixon. Len was head of the litigation department at the law firm where Nixon became the name partner. And Len said to me after the midterm elections in 1970, I was licking my wounds because I wasn't sure what it meant for me, my future, because Nixon was soured on it. And so Len walked into my office, and I keep a diary, and I've got this exactly in my diary. And he said, you know, Ehrlichman and you work for a very difficult man. And he said, it's the changes in him. It's the changes, the mood changes. He said, he has in him the good and evil that every one of us has in themselves, and that which is in the society as a whole. He moves from rage to generosity, from eloquence to something other. It's just who he is. So there was that side of him which people could play on. Always the paranoia, you could see that. And it's tragic. I mean, he was a flawed character. Wonderful, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Could be not conventionally amusing. He wasn't an easy conversationalist, but he was thoughtful of people. One maybe I'll end on this if I could. Pat Buchanan tells the story. Pat Buchanan being the wild-eyed right-winger adversary and friend of mine from those days. And Pat ran for president twice, as you remember. And in the primaries, I guess he was running against Bush in 92, or maybe it was 96. Pat would keep swinging, and he got second in New Hampshire, and third here, and fourth there, and third here, and so on. He tells the story. He said, so I called Nixon. I said, boss, I just want to tell you, I got not only second in New Hampshire, I got third, and so I got fourth here. He said, it's just rousingly good. And Nixon says, Buchanan, you are the only extremist I know with a sense of humor. So I end on that, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. I loved it. I loved the opportunity. Thank you. Thank all of you.
We have books to sell, and I'm getting one because, yes, I want to know how the heck this unholy alliance killed universal health care, but I'm not upset about it or anything. I'd also like to invite people to UCF Celebrates the Arts and Humanities from April 5th to April 16th. And I would like to thank you all for coming very much. I think this was great. I have to say, it really brought me back to my teenage years. Whoa, that's all I got to say. Anyway, thank you so much for coming, and remember the books. Bye.